Hello and welcome to the third round of the Steam Showdown tournament. We're still playing with our mono red deck, and today we're up against a Right Justice who is piloting a Sultai colored Sacrifice deck. It's a very interesting deck with a lot of different win conditions, one of them being Sphinx's Tutelage. There's a lot of Scion generation going on with cards like Blisterpod, Carrier Thrall and even From Beyond. And then there's a couple of finishers like the Smothering Abomination. Then we also have Drowner of Hope and a couple planeswalkers like Kiora and Ob Nixilis. So let's dive right into it here with game number 1, where we are on the draw. We have to mulligan a hand with too many expensive cards in it. Our second hand is fine, although we do have 4 lands, which is a bit much, so hopefully we don't draw too many more, since 4 lands is where we basically want to stop drawing lands. Our opponent leads off with a tap land turn 1, so we might have a chance at getting this Glory Chaser Renowned if our opponent doesn't play a blocker next turn. We also drew into our Dragon, which is one of the better finishers in this matchup, since our opponent doesn't have a lot of flying creatures and is pretty light on removal, but our opponent does find a blocker for the Glory Chaser in Carrier Thrall, but we're still gonna offer the trade with the Glory Chaser and the Thrall here, since we do have a couple 2-drops in hand. Now we even have another Mage-Ring Bully, so trading the Glory Chaser for the Thrall is fine, since that'll leave our opponent with a 1/1 Scion token that can't really block a 2/2 Mage-Ring Bully very well. So our opponent gets a Scion token and we play out our Mage-Ring Bully, which is better than the Abbot of Keral Keep, since we can't get any value from the Abbot this turn. Our opponent goes a land into a second Carrier Thrall, which we'll be able to trade with our Mage-Ring Bully unless we can find an instant or sorcery to enable prowess. Instead we find a second Abbot of Keral Keep, so here we decide to run out one of the 2 Abbots and hope to find a 1 mana instant so that we can enable prowess on the Mage-Ring Bully. We want to play the Abbot before playing our land, just in case that we exile a land with the Abbot. Instead we just find a Dragon Fodder, which unfortunately we can't cast here, so we just have to attack with the Mage-Ring Bully, and our opponent will accept the trade with the Carrier Thrall, leaving our opponent with 2 1/1 Eldrazi Scion creature tokens. Our opponent untaps and plays a Flashback Marauder, which will force us to sacrifice our only creature, and this will leave our opponent with a 3/1 and a 1/1 token in play. The token will get in for 1 point of damage and will claim a first blood in this game, dropping us down to 19, and in the second main phase the token gets sacrificed to cast a Shadows of the Past, which will allow our opponent to scry whenever a creature dies and later can also be used to gain some life back. Here we draw into our Akoum Firebird, which is a great creature in this matchup since our opponent doesn't have a ton of flying blockers, so we can go land into Firebird and hit our opponent for 3 points of hasty damage, since playing the bird makes more sense than the dragon here, since the dragon will force us to discard our hand at the end of turn, which is not what we want to do. So we get in for 3, put our opponent down to 17 and pass the turn. Our opponent will attack with the Flashback Marauder, which will put us at 16 life, and in the second main phase our opponent will run out Evolutionary Leap, and the last card in our opponent's hand is Sphinx's Tutelage, which will complete the enchantment trifecta on the opponent's side. So now we get to untap, we find a Fiery Impulse, which we can use to clear out the Flashback, but instead we decide to run out the Abbot of Keral Keep first, see what we exile, and we find a Mage-Ring Bully, which we might as well play instead of the one we have in hand here, since that'll give us some extra value. So we run out the Mage-Ring Bully and attack for 3 points of damage in the air with our Akoum Firebird, putting the opponent at 14 as we pass the turn here. The Sphinx's Tutelage will trigger, and in this case only mills us for 2 cards, and we did not lose anything too relevant, and the card our opponent drew for the turn was another copy of Sphinx's Tutelage, so our opponent is gonna try to mill us out with these 2 enchantments, so we just have to make sure to kill our opponent before that happens. Our draw is an Ember Hauler, but we're just gonna use this opportunity to get rid of the Flashback Marauder with the Fiery Impulse. Our opponent can sacrifice it to Evolutionary Leap in response to find a replacement creature. Our opponent now also has 3 creatures in the graveyard, so it's pretty close to activating the Shadows of the Past to gain 2 life. but we're just gonna enable prowess here on our 2 prowess creatures, so we can get in for a healthy amount of damage with the creatures we have in play. This will drop our opponent down to 5 life, as we can also still add an Ember Hauler to the board, as well as leave up the activation of the Ember Hauler should it get removed somehow. On our opponent's turn, the 2 Sphinx's Tutelage will trigger, and they will mill us for a total of 4 cards, so that means that no double red cards were revealed with it. And the draw for the turn for the opponent was Elvish Visionary, which will draw our opponent another card, and this will cause the Sphinx's Tutelages to trigger once again. And this time around they mill us for a total of 6 cards, so that means that 1 double red pair was revealed to it. And now our opponent plays out the Blister Pod that we knew about, and our opponent is currently dead on board because of our Firebird and the Ember Hauler activation, or just an attack with all our ground creatures. So our opponent is forced to sacrifice the Blister Pod to the Evolutionary Leap to try and find an answer to the current board state. So our opponent gets a Scion token from the Blister Pod and reveals a second Blister Pod to the Evolutionary Leap, but our opponent doesn't have any green mana left to replay the Blister Pod, so just has to pause the turn for a last time here, as we can simply play out our land and attack with everyone. Our opponent can only block 2 of our ground creatures, so we'll at least take 5 damage total, which happens to be exactly our opponent's life total, so we don't even have to activate the Ember Hauler to deal 2 damage to the opponent. We can just let combat damage happen. So that means Monored is up 1 game over Sultai Sacrifice. In game 2 we're on the play, and we decide to keep our opening hand, even though it is a little bit sketchy only having 1 creature in it. So this hand is gonna rely pretty heavily on our Foundry Street Denizen, but we do have 2 Infectious Bloodlust to enchant our Denizen with, plus a piece of disruption in Fiery Impulse. So hopefully that's gonna be good enough, as we draw a second copy of Foundry Street Denizen, but we're still just gonna play out our land and enchant our first Denizen with our Bloodlust to get in for 3 points of damage, putting our opponent down to 17, and then next turn the plan is to play out our second Denizen and enchant it with the Bloodlust, giving it haste and getting in for at least 7 points of damage. But our opponent does have the turn 2 Carrier Thrall, which will be able to trade with our Foundry Street Denizen unless we put a second enchantment on it, but that would be putting all our eggs in one basket, which is risky for opponent has a removal spell like Bone Splinters, so instead we just Fiery Impulse the Thrall so that we can attack with our Foundry Street Denizen without trading, and we just play out our second Denizen to advance our board state a little bit. We attack for 4, and our opponent decides to chump with the Scion token, so that means that if our opponent has a 4-drop, he won't be able to play it on the following turn. Instead, the play for the turn is just going to be an Elvish Visionary, drawing the opponent a card, and the land for the turn will come into play tapped, as our opponent passes back. On our turn, we draw into another land, which is not really what we want here, since we're slowly running out of cards to play, so we just enchant our second Denizen, get in for 6 points of damage. Our opponent decides to chump one of the 2 creatures, only taking 3 damage down to 14 as we pass the turn back. Our opponent plays out a 4th land, and the play for the turn is going to be an Eyeless Watcher, which brings along 2 Eldrazi Sign tokens, so that's enough to trade with one of our 2 creatures as well as perhaps chump the other one. We draw into an Arsonist, get a little careless and forget to play out our Arsonist in our first main phase to pump our 2 Denizens. Our opponent is indeed going to trade with one of the Denizens and is just gonna let the 3 other damage through, so that means that we missed out on 1 point of damage here by not playing the Arsonist in the first main phase. We grab another Infectious Bloodlust because the other one died. So here we decide to pause a turn instead of playing out the Arsonist, so that next turn we can play the Arsonist, enchant it with the Bloodlust, giving it haste, and also pump the Denizen. And here our opponent is going to play out a From Beyond as we draw into an Exquisite Firecraft, which will be able to deal 4 damage to the opponent, so that means we only need to deal 7 more damage to the opponent to try and win this game, as we play out the Arsonist, bumping the Denizen, enchant it with the Bloodlust, giving it haste, get in for 7 points, but our opponent is going to chump the Denizen, so only takes 3 damage, goes down to 8. So if we can top deck into our second Exquisite Firecraft, we can close out this game if our opponent doesn't gain any life. Opponent fetches with Evolving Wilds, gets a Sign token from Beyond, and plays out a Drowner of Hope, which is pretty accurate here since we're gonna have a hard time beating the Drowner of Hope, since he can tap down our creatures every turn, and he synergizes very nicely with the From Beyond that's in play. As we draw into another land, go to combat, our creatures are forced to attack because of the Infectious Bloodlust, so that means that our Arsonist is going on a suicide mission here, attacking into the 5/5 Drowner. We decide to redirect the 1 point of damage to the opponent, hoping to somehow burn our opponent out. We know we have 4 points of burn in our hand, we just need to find 3 more points of damage somewhere. But we keep drawing lands here, so that's gonna be difficult. Our opponent gets another token from the From Beyond and decides not to attack with the Drowner of Hope, instead keeps it on defense as it will be able to eat the Foundry 3 Denizen, which is forced to attack, and plays out a Smothering Abomination, which will start drawing the opponent into more and more cards as we draw into yet another land. So the Denizen is forced to attack. Our opponent is going to let that attack happen and decides to block with the Drowner of Hope. We do have the option of using the Exquisite Firecraft on the Drowner of Hope, but at this point we're just hoping to top deck into a second Exquisite Firecraft to try and close out this game. I don't think we have any other outs left. Our opponent gets another Sign token, sacrifices it to the Smothering Abomination to draw another card. And now we're gonna face a pretty quick clock here from the opponent, which can hit us for more than 10 damage in one hit here, dropping us down to 9 life. And in the second main phase, our opponent is gonna run out a Nantuko Husk, which synergizes very nicely with the Smothering Abomination, as well as another Elvish Visionary, so has more than enough blockers should we top deck a hasty creature somehow. We draw into another land, and at this point we're just gonna give our opponent a small heart attack by targeting him with the Exquisite Firecraft, putting the opponent down to 3 life, and at this point we've conceded the game, we pass the turn. Our opponent gets another Sign token, which gets sacrificed to the Abomination to draw an extra card, and one attack here with the team is gonna be more than enough to close out this game. So Sultai sacrifice equalizes the score here, as it's now 1 apiece, and everything will be decided in the third and final game. In game 3 we are on a play, and we start with an opening hand that does not have any 1-drop creatures in it, so I would be tempted to mulligan, but this hand actually has some great tools in this matchup, like Twin Bolt that can clear multiple blockers, and like Akoum Firebird that can fly over for a lot of damage, so we decide to keep this hand. Also, our opponent has a lot of cheap creatures that can jump in front of our 1-drops, Blizzardpod here being the prime example, so we're already pretty happy that we decided to keep this hand. So on our turn we draw into an Abbot of Keral Keep, but we're just gonna play out the Ember Hauler here, since that's better in this current board state, and also we can get some more value from the Abbot later, hopefully. Our opponent plays out a second land into Elvish Visionary, so that means our opponent can already block and trade with the Ember Hauler that's in play, so we probably need to get rid of one of those creatures, as we draw into a Goblin Glory Chaser, which we would like to try and get online here. So we decide to attack with our Ember Hauler, which will probably prompt our opponent into double blocking it, which is exactly what happens. So now we can use our Fiery Impulse to get rid of one of the 2 blockers, so that our Ember Hauler can still eat the second creature, reducing the number of creatures in play. And now we can play out our Glory Chaser, which now has a higher chance of becoming a Renowned, which would be pretty valuable here. And our opponent will just run out a third land and plays out a From Beyond, so now has no blockers left, so the Goblin Glory Chaser will be able to become Renowned. as we still don't draw into a third land. So here we're just going to try and find a land with the Abbot of Keral Keep, which will exile the top card of our library, hoping to exile a land. Instead, what we exile with the Abbot is an Avaricious Dragon, which is not really what we needed here, so we just get in for 3 points of damage, putting the opponent down to 17, and more importantly, our Goblin Glory Chaser becomes renowned, making him a lot more difficult to block for the opponent, as he now has Menace. Our opponent gets a Scion token on his upkeep, plays out an Evolving Wilds, and plays out a Sphinx's Tutelage in the second main phase, so that thing will slowly start milling us, so we need to try and close out the game as quickly as possible, as we still don't find a third land, but here we can just play out a Dragon Fodder, which will still advance our board state, will also enable prowess on the Abbot, so our opponent can't simply trade with it with the Scion token, so we get in for a total of 7 points of damage. Our opponent does indeed chump with the Scion token, so only takes 4, goes down to 13, and fetches a land with the Evolving Wilds. And on the opponent's turn, both the Sphinx's Tutelage and the From Beyond will trigger, giving him a Scion token and milling us for a bunch. In this case, we get milled for 4, so that means that our opponent hit a double red combination, and our opponent also has a Carrier Thrall plus another Evolving Wilds and passes back. On our turn, we still don't find our third land, but we do have a second Dragon Fodder we could play, but Twin Bolt is actually the better play here, since that'll clear a blocker and also will enable prowess on the Abbot of Keral Keep. Our opponent will still get a Scion token, so does have the option of trading with a Goblin token, or perhaps just chumping the Abbot once again. So we get in with everyone, and our opponent does decide to chump the Abbot, so only takes 6, goes down to 7 points of life, gets another Sphinx's Tutelage trigger, gets another Scion token from the From Beyond. We get milled for 2, go down to 41 cards left in library. Our opponent has another Carrier Thrall and a Nantuko Husk, which is pretty good against our red removal, since our opponent can just sacrifice a creature in response to grow the Nantuko Husk out of burn range. But we actually already have all the tools we need in our hand to close out this game. Since our opponent has 3 blockers, we have 5 attackers plus a Titan Strength, so we just need to get rid of one more blocker here using the Fiery Impulse. We don't want to target the Thrall because that still gets our opponent another Scion token. We don't want to use the Fiery Impulse on the Nantuko Husk, since again our opponent can sacrifice the Carrier Thrall in response to still get a blocker and make the Nantuko Husk survive, so we just use the Fiery Impulse on the one Scion token, attack with everyone, and now use Titan Strength on one of our unblocked creatures, and that will mean that we get exactly 7 points of damage in, which is our opponent's life total. So our opponent can still use the Nantuko Husk, sacrificing the Carrier Thrall, but that's not going to matter here since blockers have already been assigned. That Scion token cannot block any of our creatures. We scry a land to the top because why not? And that's gonna be it. Monored wins 2-1 over Sultai Sacrifice. So now we have 2 wins and 1 loss in the tournament. There are still 2 rounds left to go in the Swiss rounds, and then there will be a cut to top 8, and hopefully we will be part of that. But for now, I want to thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this gameplay, and as always, have a nice day.